NATO is at breaking point. The most successful defence alliance in history risks losing support from its biggest backer, the US. And other members have lost trust in the United States, putting the collective of 32 countries on rocky ground. Their pact to come to each other's aid if under attack is based on trust. And there's very little of that going around right now. Elizabeth Braw can tell us more about what that means and where we're headed. She's from the Scowcroft Centre for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council, an American think tank that promotes US leadership and transatlantic ties. Elizabeth, since US President Donald Trump's first term, he's complained European nations don't pull their weight. He said they don't have his back in the Iran war. NATO is undergoing significant pressure to adapt to his demands. Is the alliance in for some big changes, do you think?
It's not only in for some big changes, the changes are already happening because, as you said, the alliance's most important, most powerful member is in the person of Donald Trump, questioning the nature of the alliance, the value of the alliance. And the more President Trump keeps speaking or doubting NATO as an alliance, doubting the other member states' commitment, then the more he does that, the more he weakens NATO. Mm-hmm. And even though the other member states are committed, even though they have no beef with fundamental beef with the alliance, every time he talks about it, by discrediting it, he weakens it, and by extension changes NATO as an alliance. That doesn't mean it's dead or that it's destined to die. It just means it's weakened, and that is regrettable.
Well, that said, Elizabeth, I think it's interesting then to have a listen to NATO Chief Mark Rutte, because he's been echoing some of Trump's woes with the group.
So business as usual will not meet this moment. And allow me here to applaud President Trump for his bold leadership and vision. When it came time to provide the logistical and other support the United States needed in Iran, some allies were a bit slow, to say the least. Nearly without exception, allies are doing everything the United States is asking. They have heard and are responding to President Trump's requests. NATO is there, of course, to protect the Europeans, but also to protect the United States.
So Trump has managed to change NATO already. What else does he want from NATO, do you think?
He wants the other allies to do what America needs them to do. Now, until the Iran war, he hadn't made specific requests. His initial complaint about the other member states, most of the other member states, was that they didn't spend enough on their own defense. And it's interesting to hear how that narrative has evolved over the years. From the time of his first administration, he did have a point that they weren't spending enough on their defense. But I think already then it wasn't really clear whether he really wanted them to spend more on their defense, and as a result to strengthen NATO, or whether it was just something that he wanted to complain about because he felt America was being taken advantage of. So it's not clear whether in his first term his objective really was to strengthen NATO or simply to complain about the other NATO member states. Not all of them, once again, not all of them were deficient when it comes to spending. A number of them, including Estonia, for example, were spending the required 2% and even on top of that. But that was his complaint in the first term. Now, in his second term, as we know, his narrative has moved from defense spending to complaining that the other member states haven't supported the United States in Iran. Now, it's worth remembering that NATO is a defensive alliance that exists to defend its member states when they are attacked. What we have in Iran is the United States went to war against Iran, so is in that context the aggressor. So there is no requirement on the other NATO member states to support America, but he, for reasons that remain inexplicable, seems to expect other NATO member states to come to America's aid in this war.
But he's been clear about his threats, hasn't he? I mean, he's been threatening the whole way to pull the US out of NATO. But what's more likely, the US pulling out or disengaging in some way?
Disengaging, for sure, if only because leaving NATO would require congressional approval, and that would be extremely hard to get, even as Congress currently stands, with Republicans being very loyal to President Trump. There is enough support for NATO within the Republican Party, which we should remember has always been the party of strong defense, of strong transatlantic ties. There is enough of that left in the Republican Party, and of course also among the Democrats, that a withdrawal from NATO would not be likely in Congress. So what President Trump can instead do, and is probably likely to do, is to do less, is to have America do less for NATO, and that would be incredibly damaging. We should remember that even though he has complained about NATO for a long time, America has remained involved and did remain involved in his first term. But now, with him being so upset about Iran, and even mentioning Greenland, essentially mentioning that if you don't support us over Iran, we may return to the idea of Greenland. So with that being the case, I think his disappointment or anger with the other NATO allies will at the very least lead to less US engagement in NATO. And that is a highly regrettable thing, because now, as I think nobody needs to be reminded, now is a very perilous time in international relations, and it's a perilous time for every single NATO member state.
And Elizabeth, when you say that would be extremely damaging, what would that look like in real terms?
So, at the risk of engaging in hypothetical scenarios, but let's say, let's just look at what's already happening. The fact that President Trump discredits NATO on a regular basis, floats the idea of the United States leaving NATO, floats the idea of annexing Greenland. All of that emboldens Russia, because what deters Russia is a strong NATO where every member is committed to collective defense. If you don't keep, you as NATO and its 32 member states, if you don't keep constantly signaling that, then you are signaling the opposite to Russia, namely that NATO is weakened, that it's divided, and that provides an opening for Russia should it wish to harm one or more NATO member states.
The other thing I wanted to bring up was that this isn't just about the US, because other NATO members are losing trust in the US itself as a partner. Where does that leave the alliance?
It's obvious for, I think, the whole world to see that the United States has been very dismissive of European countries and Canada, and that has resulted in the public in European countries and Canada feeling rather hurt and losing faith in the United States. We have seen, for example, a Danish app called Non-USA that allows users to see what products are made by companies based in the US, or made by companies that are owned by American companies. That app has become incredibly popular because Danes are falling out of love with the United States, and that is just such a tragedy, because the transatlantic link has lasted for decades, through the darkest decades of the Cold War and after that too. But that bond is under heavy strain now, and voters here around Europe are saying, well, America is not what it used to be. And with voters losing faith in that transatlantic bond, politicians obviously have to balance that on one hand with keeping President Trump happy on the other hand. But it's regardless which side has more weight at any given moment, the fact that politicians in European countries and Canada even have to choose between their electorate and keeping Donald Trump happy is a tragedy and weakens NATO.
But Elizabeth, isn't change sometimes a good thing? I mean, even the head of the group admits it's time for change. Have a listen to this.
This alliance is not whistling past the graveyard. We are in a period of profound change in the transatlantic alliance. Europe is assuming a greater and fairer share of the task of providing for its conventional defense. And from that, there will be no going back, and nor should there be. This is a move from unhealthy codependence to a transatlantic alliance grounded in true partnership.
So is that the solution? No more codependencies?
Mark Rutte is being caught between a rock and a hard place. He has to keep the alliance together while also keeping Donald Trump happy. So that's when he speaks, that is the dilemma or the conflict that his words reflect. It is clear that NATO can change, can evolve, and so forth. And we should remember that on the level of civil servants of the armed forces, NATO still works extremely well. But all of that is undermined by public pronouncements, by leaders doubting the value of NATO. And I say leaders in plural, but really it is Donald Trump. So what is already happening within NATO is that European countries are assuming more responsibility. Yes, more senior positions within the military structure are being taken over by Europeans, and that is a good thing and reflects the reality. An interesting aspect to consider, though, is the fact that the United States has, for all these years since NATO was founded, enjoyed the unchallenged leadership position within NATO. And, for example, secures the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe has always been an American. Now, if European countries assume more responsibility, that also means that America won't have that unquestioned, unchallenged leadership role within NATO, with essentially the United States having the strongest position, the most say. It will still be a very strong country, but not that unchallenged leader. And that is a reality the US would need to get used to. And it is very, not just very nice, it is indispensable, even if you're a major country, to have a group of nations that support you not just militarily, but diplomatically, politically, in different undertakings. And that is what the United States has received through NATO. If it weakens its commitment to NATO, which is likely to happen and already beginning to happen, then that support is likely to weaken too.
Well, Trump's fury with NATO allies is binding them together against him. Let's have a listen to this soundbite. Germany is NATO's largest defence spender here in Europe. Here's the German leader.
We want to ensure that this war, which has become a transatlantic stress test, does not place any further strain on relations between the United States and its European NATO partners. Whilst I fully understand the calls for a clear stance, let me say this here and now. I do not want a split in NATO. NATO is a guarantor of our security, including and above all in Europe. We must continue to keep a cool head.
And let's listen to what Trump had to say a few days ago.
When I heard the head of Germany say, this is not our war about Iran, I said, well, Ukraine's not our war. We helped, but Ukraine's not our war. I thought it was a very inappropriate statement to make.
So Merz just said cool heads, but he and other NATO allies clearly angered Trump by not supporting his war against Iran. Where does that leave us?
In a very difficult place. Trump confuses two different kinds of war. Ukraine was invaded under the United Nations Charter. Other UN member states have the responsibility to support Ukraine. It has nothing to do with NATO. Now, NATO has stepped in and been part of that group supporting Ukraine, but it has nothing to do with NATO as such, because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. And on that note, it is regrettable that so many countries around the world have declined or refrained from supporting Ukraine. It is their obligation under the United Nations Charter, which they have conveniently forgotten or ignored. Then when it comes to Iran, it is a war of aggression. How can NATO member states or how can NATO, which is a defensive alliance, support a war of aggression? It doesn't work. And not only is NATO a defensive alliance, it's an alliance that defends its member states against aggression from other countries. So, but all of this has been explained to Donald Trump. He is just he chooses not to accept that state of affairs, and I don't think anybody can explain it to him. I certainly hope Mark Rutte has explained to him how NATO works, but it's he clearly doesn't want to understand or accept how NATO is set up, and if Mark Rutte can't explain it or isn't willing to explain it, how is anybody else going to explain it?
Well, I'm sure our viewers are thankful that you could explain it. Elizabeth, to be fair, though, at the end of the day, could all this pressure from Trump create a stronger NATO?
Well, I would like to hear from your viewers how it might produce a stronger NATO. I think a stronger NATO is a NATO in which all member states are fully committed to the alliance. And yes, NATO, like any other organization, has various weak points, but then you articulate those in off camera, in candid discussions between leaders, between officials, and that is what has been done for decades. You don't wash your dirty laundry in public, and if you do so, you weaken the alliance, and there is only one benefit from it, and that is that Russia and other adversaries sense an opportunity, sense their power growing every time you criticize the alliance in public. And that is regrettable, because NATO has been incredibly successful. It has been successful because all its member states have been committed, even countries that don't really get along, like Greece and Turkey. All of them have been committed. They haven't always been agreed in private, but in public, they have buried the hatchet and been committed members of NATO. It is such, it's incredibly regrettable and such a tragedy that unity is breaking now, that we need it more than ever.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for spending so much of your night with us. Hope to talk again soon.
Thank you.
And what do you think? Will Trump's criticism create a stronger NATO? Let us know in the comments. I'm Ben Fazulin. See you again soon.